This is Australia, one of the worst countries to live today.
Tonight, fresh warnings we could be heading for a recession, with predictions that 100,000 Aussies will lose their jobs in the next year.
High mortgage rates and increasing home prices have led housing affordability to its worst level on record.
The nation is now home to 27 million people.
There was about 72 people. Everyone was four in a tiny little shoebox of a room and sharing a bathroom and not much personal space.
This government is hopeless.
Back then, I was lied to as a child, and I have a feeling you were too. My eyes were fleet without rest, from television screen to newspaper to magazine, keeping me in a sort of orgasm without release through a series of teasing glimpses of shiny automobiles, shiny female bodies and other sensuous surface such as natural wonders, wide open space, beach and beautiful breeze, convincing myself that the Australia is a paradise by the media. But this was far from the truth. I was sold an illusion. This is the dark side of Australia. Australia is the planet's 6th largest country after Russia, Canada, China, USA and Brazil. At 7.7 million square kilometer, it is the smallest continent and is the world's largest island, over double the size of India and 14 times bigger than the France, with one of the highest average wages in the world. That makes a perfect sense. Due to its abundant amount of land and wealthy people, the cost of housing in Australia is affordable, right? Hell no. Over the last few decades, Australia has experienced one of the greatest housing booms the world has ever seen. Since 1973, Australian house prices have increased by 36 times across the capital cities, and life has been an endless string of problems for the Australian people. Since the 1950s, owning a home, or rather a house, has been the ultimate sign that you made it, a symbol of stability, security in many social, cultural and economical aspects. If you haven't grown up in Australia, it's very hard to understand the country's obsession with investing in property. It's like a national sport over here. While in the great American dream, we are convinced that the hard work is everything and sleep is a waste of valuable time, and continue to chase the fantasies far into the night. In the great Australian dream, it's the desire for every Australian family to own their own home. But unfortunately, the dream of owning your own home have turned into the nightmare of owning your own tent. According to the 2023 report across Australia, only 0.8% of private rentals are affordable for a person on the minimum wage, and just 0.4% are affordable for the single person on the age pension. There are around 650,000 households which cannot afford housing at market rates in Australia now, and this figure is projected to reach over 1 million by 2036. Sydney is now the second most unaffordable place to live in the world after Hong Kong, and Melbourne is ranked the 71st most expensive city globally per Mercer's Cost of Living City Ranking 2023. In 1970s, the average salary was $4,200 and the average house price was $18,700. So this means that if you save your salary for 4.5 years, you can afford the home in Sydney. But looking at now, the average salary is $74,000, which grew up by 17 times. Which is great, to be honest, but the average price of house in Sydney has been skyrocketed to $1.6 million, which has been ballooned by 22 times over the 5 decades and 11 times more than the before year. To buy the median home in Melbourne, a family needs to earn at least $170,000 per year, and median household income in Melbourne is $96,000, $2,006 weekly. Because of the overpriced housing, according to the comparethemarket.com, Australia has the 5th highest housing debt in the world. For the most Australian people, housing has been like a beautiful woman who will never be caught and whose very flightness is her charm. Okay, housing is expensive, so the renting might be cheap, right? Hell no. Similarly, renting has hiked off the roof in Australia. According to the report of the Mojo.com, data from the domain shows advertised rental price for house in Australia's capital cities surged 11.1% over the last year to June 2024 and 3.2% over the last quarter. For regional renters, house rents increased 7.8% over the year to June 2024 and 1.9% over the quarter. Sydney remains the most expensive city to rent a house in, with median weekly rent sitting at $750. Capital city Canberra takes the second place at $690 per week, followed by Darwin $660 per week, Perth $650 per week, and Brisbane $630 per week. To put things into perspective, this is the graph of the median weekly rent for a house in Australia for the combined capitals and the combined regions from June 2022 to June 2024. The median weekly rent of the combined capitals has increased from $520 to $650 over the span of 2 years, and the median weekly rent of the combined regions has increased from $480 to $550 because of the lack of housing and heavy renter competition has left many applicants feeling they have to bid above the advertised price or offer to pay several months worth of rent in advance just to secure a rental property. Despite prohibition on rent bidding, high growth has also made landlords more comfortable passing along outrageous price hikes, especially in states or territories where there aren't any restriction on how much a landlord can raise the rent, like NSW. Rental price of Sydney has increased by 7.5% from the last year, Melbourne by 10%, and Brisbane and Adelaide by 14.3% and 11.6% respectively. And the sad part is that almost half of the Australian renters, 49%, spent at least 30% of their income on the rent in 2024, placing them in a financial stress. And worryingly, 1 in 10 Australian renters, 11%, now spend more than 60% of their income to keep a roof over their head, up from 7% in 2023 and 4% in 2022. Look at this comment by the young Australian. I am Australian and last year I had to leave my rental apartment in Melbourne. Rent price soared from around $420 per week in 2020 to $650 per week to $700 per week for a similar 2-bedroom apartment by 2023. As a teacher, I was forced to move when the owner sold the property, facing skyrocketing rents with no available option. The situation became so dire that I had to return to my hometown of Perth. After living in Melbourne for 20 years, relying on my cousin's kindness for shelter, I'm still here, where rentals start at $550 per week and any decent apartment costs between $650 and $800 per week. I had to give away thousands of dollars worth of furniture in Melbourne and leave my friends behind, completely uprooting my life. This greedy, appealing housing crisis has turned my world upside down, and now I have to start over as a matured age man. What is worse is that many Aussies people have given up and starting to wake up to the fact that the conventional path of owning their own home or renting are not for them, so they are started to living in the camper vans. And the problem doesn't end here for the poor Australians. Another concerning factor is the wage. Wages aren't keeping up with the cost of renting. Over the year to June 2024, the wage price index grew by 4.1%, while combined capital city rents soared to 11.1% for house. This misalignment in the wage versus rental price growth shows how just jarring it's been for the Aussies scrambling to cover the cost of the rising rents. But why the hell real estate has been so expensive in Australia? An increasing demand of housing is because of the rapid population growth, terrible economic policies and the Australian culture. In Australia, 90% of population live in the cities. Out of 90%, 72% live in the major cities, and out of 72%, 40% live in the Sydney and Melbourne. Even though Australia has unlimited land, majority population wants to live in same tiny area near the coastal zones because an estimated 40% of Australia is considered inhabitable and rest 50% are not suitable for the Australian needs. Settling near a water source proves easier than settling in or near a desert. Water sources are effective location for travel, food, fresh water supply and trade endeavors, as well as more temperate climate. And Australian culture places a great emphasis on the subordinate environment and plenty of space to raise children. They believe these coastal areas are dense and living here is considered safe and provides the social security. This simple logic should dictate that so there is limited supply of land and majority population wants to settle in the same tiny area, Australia has to focus on high density housing that can accommodate lots of people. Opposite of doing that, many Australian cities have become like Ouroboros, the misguided snake who tries to eat his own tail. Instead of building high-density housing, they are building single-family homes and ever more sprawling suburban neighborhoods. Because as mentioned earlier in the Great Australian Dream, people want their own home. They don't want to share their house with others. It's like it's not my yard, I want my own yard. It's no rocket science that the more the population, more the demand of the housing. Australia's population reached 27 million at the end of the March this year. Annual population growth was driven largely by overseas migration, and Australia's population roughly increases by 400,000 people per year. However, the construction of the new homes has failed to keep pace with this demand, leading to a housing shortage in Australia. In the time span of 2022 to 2023, Australia welcomed nearly 740,000 people. That's more immigrants than any year in modern Australian history, and 200,000 more than the pre-COVID levels. The data does not lie. 2023 saw the completion of 170,000 homes, the fewest in 10 years. Meanwhile, the Australia saw the biggest spikes in immigration in a generation. By 2050, Australia is projected to have 38 million people, and the migrants will be a key driving force of the economy. With the nation feeling the pressure of a housing crisis, some believe the Australian government needs to ease housing demand by limiting international migration. But honestly, the idea of limiting housing demand by curbing migration does not make any sense in the long term from an economic perspective. Among non-refugees, younger and high-skilled migrants dominate the lot. They provide much-needed labor skills and sustain the economy. Migrants help Australia as much as Australia helps them achieve their life's goal. Clearly, limiting international migration is not a realistic policy option. The best thing Australia can do is learn the lesson from Singapore. In 1959, when Singapore obtained self-governance from the British, the city was having a severe housing crisis. Struggling to accommodate its growing population, Singapore's first Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew and his government set up the Housing and the Development Board, or SBD, a public housing agency with a mission to build rental units for the poor. At the time, many immigrants, including those from Malaysia, were living in unhygienic slums. But as today, Singapore have completely solved its housing problems. But how? Just by government being the property developer and building more public housing. Public housing is often considered low in quality and high in crime, but it's a totally different story in Singapore. Government-built apartments in Singapore are clean, safe and well-maintained, and about 80% of Singaporean households live in them. Singapore is also one of the few countries in the world to achieve almost full homeownership status. Over 90% of the city's households own their own homes. So, we can do the same. We can repeat the history itself. Just copy-paste the Singapore strategies, build more public housing. Problem solved. It is as simple as that. But this might never happen. The social housing is a direct competition to the private property market, and elites on the top wouldn't allow the concerning bodies to implement this public housing policy because two of the biggest parties in Australia are funded by the property industry. More than a third of the cash flowing to the Liberal and the Labour parties is coming from the shadow entities that can hide the true source of the funds. According to a new analysis that shows the main parties collected $1.2 billion over the past 2 decades. The property industry led the list of business sectors, donating to both parties, giving $37.4 million to the Labour and $53.1 million to the coalition. But the study by the Centre for Public Integrity and Independent Organization concludes that too many other donations are being hidden. And this is the money we know about on papers. There might be more money behind the scenes. So it's obvious policies are gonna be made. favoring the private property developers, and this is the exact reason why the development of the public housing vanished over the decade. This is the report by the financialreview.com. At the meantime of housing crisis, Lang Waka's developer profits increases by 30%, mate, by 30%. The system is broken, right? No, mate. The system is not broken, it's working exactly as intended. Politicians and their mates are richer than ever. Australia's current policies work for the older people or the people with wealth. Australia's government is no longer service to the Australia but a service for themselves. Look at this report by theguardian.com. A survey of the Register of the Interest reveals MPs and senators owns 237 houses or apartments, including their primary and Canberra residence. Karen Andrews owns 6 investment properties. Tony Brook and Luce Miller-Frost owns 4 investment properties, and MP Andrew Wilcox owns 5 investment property. This is a housing crisis for us, for middle class people, cause we cannot afford one, but for the corrupt politicians, private property developers and the AB Jennings, this situation is like license to print money. The best excuse that the private property developers have came up with is government red tape, which leads to extremely long approval times for housing development. But according to the report of the Daily Telegraph, almost 1 billion worth of housing in Sydney's most affordable local government areas are yet to be built, despite the DAS being approved up to 5 years ago. The DAS represent potential homes for an estimated 1,600 families, but are yet to be activated with construction and the labor cost, rising interest rates and the government taxes blamed for the delays. The government approval is not an issue. The main issue is the greed of the private property developers. They are not building more house because house has been a money printing machine for them. To put things into perspective, they have a product that everybody needs, that they control a lot of supply of, and if they fulfill the demand of the market, then the product would be sold at the normal price. But if they create the shortage, people have no option but to bid above the advertised price just to secure a roof due to the high competition despite the prohibition on rent bidding. Despite the same tiny area everyone wants to live in, they focus to construct home on the richer side so they can sell it for higher price, because housing developers are facing the same construction cost which are going up and the labor cost everywhere in Sydney. So they are going to go to the richer suburbs and build there, where houses are more expensive and poor and middle class people still once again can't afford them. Like the downfall of real estate, Australia's productivity growth has been slowing over the last few decades. Labor productivity in Australia fell by 3.7% in 2022 to 2023 as output growth failed to keep pace with surge in hours worked. The drop was attributed to the record high 6.9% increase in hours worked by the employees. According to the high-level experts, productivity growth is about working smarter, not working harder or longer. Given our labor force participation rate is near its historical high, Australia won't be able to rely on working harder or longer. The latest Swiss-based World Competitiveness Report has ranked Australia third worst of 64 countries when it comes to innovation. The core reason Australia ranks so low around ideas and innovation might be its declining productivity and rapidly slowing economy. These investment and innovation numbers are likely to get worse before they get better. What makes things even worse is high corporate tax. Only one country has a higher company tax rate than Australia in the entire world. UNSW economics professor Richard Holden said Australia had gone from having one of the lowest corporate tax rate in the world in the 1990s to one of the highest today. Australian companies paid an effective average tax rate of 28.5% on their income last year, according to the OECD's annual update of global company tax statistics. The figure was far higher than the OECD average of 22% and beaten only by Colombia, where companies paid out 33% of their income in tax, which economists say is making the country uncompetitive on the global stage. Thanks for watching.